All right, I'm going to get started. Welcome back, everyone. We are now on our technically our fifth day, I think, of this 2025 Wild Horse Summit, putting the A in advocacy. And I'm going to say, after this many days and so many terrific presentations and so much engagement from everyone participating, that I think we have been putting an A in advocacy. I'm going to say A plus. So very excited for this morning. As a reminder, the summit is being presented by Chasing Horses Wild Horse Advocates with Chris Kaman at the head, and also Save Our Wild Horses with Heather Hellier co-heading this operation. And I just, at this point, absolutely want to give a huge shout out to both of these amazing humans who have been working tirelessly to put this on and to bring everyone together. So this morning or afternoon, wherever you're based, we are going to be hearing from Chandra Rosenthal. She is the Peer Public Lands Director and Director of the Rocky Mountain Office in Denver, Colorado. She is formerly a staff attorney with Defenders of Wildlife, specializing in endangered species and public land issues. She's also worked for the USA Department of Justice and, under a legal fellowship, worked on a Superfund site with the Department of Energy. She says, "I love my job as helping the region's public service professionals do their jobs of protecting the diverse and abundant natural resources of the Rockies." And Chandra earned her degree at the University of Colorado Boulder and her law degree at Lewis and Clark Northeastern School of Law, where she focused her studies on environmental law. And I'm sure Chandra is going to give us more background on PEER. Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, is a organization that I myself, as I was saying to Chandra right before we let everyone in, I'm a fangirl. I have been utilizing and referencing PEER's data analysis reports, press releases for years now. It has been an invaluable resource in reporting on the public lands issue. I am so excited to hear from you face to face today, Chandra. And with that, I will let you go. I'm going to stop my share and you can start your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jen. That was a very nice intro. And hello, everybody. And I also want to thank Chasing Horses, Save Our Horses, and the Wild Narrative Project. Thank you to Chris, Kaman, and Heather for leading this conference, and Jen. And thank you all who are attending for your dedication to wild horse advocacy. So I want to talk a little bit about PEER. We're a national nonprofit. We're headquartered in Silver Springs, Maryland, with offices around the country. And I'm, as Jen said, in the Denver office. And we support current and former public employees who seek a higher standard of environmental ethics and scientific integrity within their agencies. We do this by defending whistleblowers, shining the light on improper or illegal government actions, and we work to improve laws and regulations. We also work with other organizations, but the folks that we work with are at every level of government. So we work with federal, state, local, tribal, and we work on a wide array of issues. We've worked with environmental and public health professionals, land managers, scientists, enforcement officers, and other civil servants. Everything we do at PEER is informed by public employees.
Hey, Chandra.
Yeah.
Just a question really quick. Are you sharing your presentation?
Yeah. Can you not see it?
Can everybody else see? I've had this problem before, so we're as the host. So
we just see you, Chandra.
Okay.
Oh. Okay. Let me try again to go to. Sorry about that.
No problem. You're not the first. In fact, I have.
Let's see how I do this one.
It might be an issue on my end. It does say multiple participants can share simultaneously, so I think we are set up on the back end. But let me know if you continue to have a challenge.
So let me do this. Go here. Let me go here.
Take your time. We are all very excited to hear from you regardless.
Let's see.
Chandra, after we gave you the permissions, did you click the share button again?
Let me try this.
There you go.
Oh yeah, you got
Can
it.
you
Perfect.
see? Okay,
Yep,
great.
we are good. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. Let's see. You can see our mission?
Yep, we're all
Great.
set. Thank you.
Great. So here, let me just move this. So I want to talk about a little bit more about how peer works, because there's a lot of stuff going on with the federal government right now. So, and if something here seems of interest to you, please reach out. And we're happy to help you guys. So some of the ways that peer works is we file information requests to expose wrongdoing, and then we sue if the agency withholds it. So we use the Freedom of Information Act. Then we actually litigate. We file lawsuits against agencies. And if an employee comes to us, they can choose to have absolutely no role in that. It can be completely anonymous. And then we will file scientific integrity complaints, Data Quality Act complaints. We request Inspector General investigations. We petition for rulemaking within agencies. And we try and figure out the agency tone or employee morale by doing employee surveys. And we maintain close ties with a lot of the media because it's important to get this information out to the public so that people like you, advocates, can have the information. Okay, so my goal today is to provide some context and insights on the livestock leasing program. So you can use this in your advocacy. So first, I'm going to talk about the BLM leasing process. That's how corporate ranchers run private livestock on our public lands. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the public subsidies for this industry and for the ranchers. So this is tied to the federal government's policy of rounding up and removing wild horses from public lands in order to offer more forage for livestock. And then I'll wrap with a discussion on some of the BLM data that BLM has that peers collected that proves this policy bias. And I'll talk about how wild horse advocates like you can use this information in your advocacy. So it seems like horses have been on, and it seems like livestock have been on our public lands forever. In 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act was passed to regulate grazing on public lands. The federal government established BLM in 1946. In 1976, Congress updated the grazing process, and that's when FLPMA was passed, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and developed the range program 2 years later in 1978. So the first Wild Horse Protection Act was created in 1959, and this was to prevent the hunting and shooting of wild horses. So why do we want to talk about livestock grazing when we advocate for wild horses on public lands? The livestock program is vast, and you'll see it's allowing the destruction of millions of acres of public lands. Wild horses are one small part of BLM's mission, but they receive an outside amount of attention. Not only is BLM prioritizing resource like forage for livestock grazing over the wild horse populations, but they're also expending a huge amount of effort to round up and remove wild horses because they don't have the ability to deal with the reforms needed in the grazing program. So here are some of the facts about what's going on. And I'm mostly going to talk about BLM today. So the number of livestock are really difficult to calculate. The agencies don't put this out publicly. So what I've used is a 2015 Forest Service report that did some calculation, and then I used a 2019 BLM report and extrapolated. So these numbers are conservative, But in 2019, BLM said that it permitted 12.3 million AUMs on public lands. And so that ballparks out to 4 million sheep, goats, and cows. And I want to thank Heather for these beautiful wild horse pictures that are in this presentation. So how do you get a livestock lease? So first you must own or lease a base property. So that's private land or a ranch that has a historical connection to the BLM land. And these are often like adjacent to the allotment, but they don't have to be. Then you contact your local BLM office. You can also look online to see if there's a grazing allotment available in your area. You fill out a grazing permit application. These are available at BLM offices. And in the application, you'll give details about your livestock operation, like the number of animals, the grazing season. BLM evaluates the application, looking at land conditions, available forage, the environmental impact. They may do a NEPA review at that time. And if it's approved, BLM issues your grazing permit or your lease. It's typically valid for 10 years, and then it's renewable. It will include the number of AUMs, which are animal unit months, the grazing schedule and conditions, and then the fees. The fees are charged per AUM, and those are updated yearly. So the fee in 2024 was $1.35 per AUM. So though many of these leases have been held by the same families for decades, despite what ranchers say, they are not owned by them. So ranchers must comply with range health standards to prevent overgrazing. There are periodic BLM inspections by staff, and at the end of the 10-year lease, you can renew it if you've met the requirements, or you can request adjustments based on your grazing needs. But an important thing for all of you advocates to note is that the permit renewal, which includes a land health assessment, and it might be done in coordination with a NEPA document, or it might be just the NEPA document, but this is the only time that the public can weigh in. So you can comment during the scoping period, and again, after the EA is published, and then after the NEPA is complete. If you've commented, you can file a protest. But if you miss that window, then you have to wait another 10 years until the lease is renewed. So the agency uses a lot of considerations when they evaluate range conditions. They'll look at watershed, ecological processes, water quality. They should do all of this. They should look at the habitat of endangered species. And if grazing causes the land to fail the BLM standards, BLM has a mandatory duty to adjust management. So I've highlighted the will here in the notice. And here are the standards and guidelines, and you've probably heard about these. They're different. They vary from state to state, but they cover ground cover, soil quality, vegetation, stream channel morphology, seed dissemination, threatened endangered species, necessary non-native plant species, and numbers 11 through 15 focus on livestock and grazing. I love this slide. BLM's Wild Horse and Burro Management Program, it's very controversial among the public. So it's often criticized for its high cost and sometimes for its inhumane treatment of wild horses. So why does BLM spend so much time and money rounding up wild horses while allowing large-scale livestock grazing? It comes down to a mix of the legal mandates, political pressure, and BLM's questionable land use priorities. Ranching groups lobby for wild horse removals, arguing that wild horses compete with livestock for resources. Energy and mining industries also push for fewer wild horses in the areas that they want to develop. In contrast to the horse program, the public rarely raises the issue of the true cost of the grazing program. But the costs of the grazing program are extremely high. Because ranchers pay a fee to lease the allotment, it may appear that it's profitable profitable for BLM. But in fact, the grazing program isn't a moneymaker. So first, compare the cost of an AUM for a private lease to the public rate of $1.35. According to BLM documents, a private lease costs between $15 and $20 per AUM, and it can be up to $44 per AUM. Then there are federal drought subsidies. These payouts to ranchers enable them to continue operations in regions that are increasingly unsuited for grazing because of permanent drought conditions. Third, there are Forest Service and BLM costs for employees dedicated to managing ranching. So there's infrastructure and maintenance costs, and they not only mask the true cost of grazing, but they also incentivize practices that exacerbate environmental degradation. So a good example of this is the BLM cost sharing for water developments like stock ponds and pipelines. BLM often provides financial or logistical support to ranchers to develop water sources on public lands. BLM argues that these ranchers argue that these water sources will distribute grazing pressure and improve the livestock access to water. These troughs and wells, which bring water from springs to different parts of the allotment, and they also can support well drilling with subsidies. But this can lead to further degradation because having water in previously less used areas, livestock can now access and overgraze riparian areas and go to the uplands that were naturally protected by limited water availability. So it can enable year-round grazing where it used to be a seasonal thing before, and this doesn't allow the land a chance to recover. Another classic example of a subsidy which has extra impacts on the land is fencing. So this is meant to control grazing rotations, but it often ends up fragmenting habitat, limiting wildlife movement, and concentrating livestock in sensitive areas. And then there are indirect costs that grazing place on the environment and ecosystem. So these costs of mitigating these impacts are often borne by federal agencies and ultimately by us, by the taxpayers. And then there's the wild horse program. If you eliminate commercial livestock grazing within the horses range, which is just a small part of our public lands, this program, the funding for this program could be significantly cut. Why should taxpayers be paying to give away public range access at fees which come nowhere close to covering the true costs? So advocates like you should be bringing up the true cost of livestock grazing in your work to allow horses and burros to forage on public lands. So here's the slide from earlier, but I've added the wild horse data. So you can see the difference in numbers. There's a disproportionate allocation of land and resources for livestock compared to horses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that Pierre has gathered from BLM. And again, I want to say this is all BLM data. So we feel that it has a lot of legitimacy with the agency. So our data shows how the agency policy unfairly targets wild horses as the cause of range degradation. So through the Freedom of Information Act, we received grazing allotment land health standard records for BLM assessments conducted between 1997 and 2023 for the 21,000 livestock allotments. So you can see the huge negative impact of livestock on public lands compared to wild horses. So all of this information is available to you in 2 reports, and we have an interactive online map, and then we have some fact sheets and just state-by-state information that's fleshed out a little bit more. So when we did get this information from BLM, there was a lot of accuracy and inconsistencies, especially with the earlier data sets. It's now been moved to online, and so it's much better, but we've had to reconcile some of that. So just so you know, as we discussed earlier about rangeland health standards, BLM is required under FLPMA, the act, to ensure that the rangeland health isn't compromised within the context of the multiple use mandate. So there's this centrality of ensuring that livestock grazing doesn't compromise rangeland health, but the agency doesn't look at the overall data. They really work allotment by allotment. And so the lack of consideration of the overall data can often mean that resource management plans, which are the management for they can last, 10, 20 years. It's really how they decide how to allocate resources. They often don't consider the overall impacts of livestock. So this is what, if you go to our interactive map, this is what the homepage looks like. So you can see we've got allotments classified by color. So if they're healthy, according to BLM, that is they're meeting all land health standards, they're green. They're red if they don't meet standards, and that's because of livestock. And then they're orange or yellow if they don't meet standards for another reason. And then there's a lot of gray, which are the areas that BLM has yet to assess, which is surprisingly high. So if you go to our map, then you can zoom in and you can look state by state, allotment by allotment. We have different layers you can turn on for herd management areas. You can look at monuments and see where there are grazing allotments that overlap with those. And we have sage-grouse habitat also as one of our overlays, so you can see where that comes in. And so I've got this these two pie charts to compare. So this is the 2019 data compared to the 2023 data. So there's a little bit of change, not a lot. But you can see where there's a difference. But if you notice, 19% of the lands have yet to be assessed by BLM. 19% don't meet BLM standards, so that's the red and the orange and yellow. And 58% of them are classified as meeting all land health standards. When you look at the field reports of the 155 million acres of leased allotments, we see that BLM identifies many reasons for an allotment to be classified as failing, but most often that reason is livestock. It's the cause of failure on 10% of the land. So lands that don't meet the standards for other reasons, so those are the yellow here, some of the listed reasons are invasive species, weeds, drought, fire, off-highway vehicles. They'll list deer, prairie dogs, and sometimes wild horses. But the data show that it's really livestock by far is the most significant cause of an allotment failing to meet land health standards. And this is the same in every state under the agency's administration. So here we have it by acreage, a different way to consider it. And when you look at the allotments that BLM has assessed, so dropping out all the allotments that were in green, you see that 50% of those that are left are failing, or a third of that are failing because of overgrazing. And you can see, looking at these acreage, that the data doesn't justify the agency's focus on reducing wild horse numbers. So in the data, horses are cited very few times as the sole cause for failing land health conditions on an allotment. So if horses are mentioned, which they are mentioned sometimes, it's cited usually in conjunction with cattle. So they'll say reasons for failing, they'll put horses and cows. Or they'll say horses and livestock. But the livestock program is really just the massive program with massive impacts. So this is another way to show the same data. And I think this is really powerful because this shows it with acreage. So I've got the red is the 2019 data, and then the purple is the 2023 data, or from when we compiled them, that's 2020 and 2024. But if you look at that, and then at the first bar is the amount of acreage that's failing because of livestock. When you look at the third set of bars, this is the amount of land that is failing solely because of wild horses. And then this second bar is livestock in conjunction with cattle. So this third bar here of wild horses is less than 1 million acres. And then this second bar here is about 6.5 million acres. But it's just a huge disparity. Now, this is our state by state data. When you're advocating with your legislature, it's really important to bring the data home and show them what's going on in their state. That's when their ears perk up. So note that Nevada is an outlier in this data. It has most of the herd management areas in it, but it also has the largest percentage of unassessed land. And this is another state by state data comparison, and this is of acreage. So these are some conclusions based on the BLM data that you can cite in your advocacy work to show that livestock are the major reason that BLM public lands are failing land health conditions, not horses. So I think BLM is using wild horse removals as a scapegoat for a largely ineffective range program. So you've seen the millions of acres that still have yet to be assessed. BLM is responding to political pressure from ranchers. And it's likely that BLM doesn't want to do something difficult and tell a rancher that is a client that they have to remove or reduce the number of livestock. So BLM identifies livestock as the most significant cause of failure, even on lands shared with horses. So there's 21.5 million acres at HMAs that have been assessed. And on 11.5 million acres, BLM cites livestock as the cause for failing conditions. So what role do wild horses play in affecting rangeland health? So this is an important question, given that BLM appears more focused on actively managing the impacts from wild horses than it is on impacts from livestock. BLM continues to round up wild horses in burrows and permanently remove them from federal rangelands. So in 2023, over 20,000 wild horses in burrows were permanently removed. Yet we see even during a national drought, BLM doesn't issue a mandatory drought call. That is, they don't issue an emergency reduction in numbers. So BLM is doing a poor job of assessing the health of the lands they manage. There are allotments that haven't been assessed in 20 or even 30 years. So we need agency change. The data shows large variations between states. So there's differences in state rangeland condition. There's differences in the way the states manage the lands, and there's also difference in state policies. The policies that BLM is implementing is often not informed by the data that it does have. Failures in properly assessing rangeland health are affecting other aspects of the environment. So not only grazing and horses, but other wildlife and the ecosystems. So we've been getting this land health data from BLM regularly, and we'll be sending in another batch of Freedom of Information Act requests to see what has changed as the Biden administration wraps up. Maybe they'll have assessed more acreage, and we'll probably have that info in 6 months to a year. So with advocacy, how can you use this information to advocate for wild horse protection on public lands? Understand and communicate the economic and ecological costs of the current livestock grazing policy. So engage, submit public comments on resource management plans and their EAs, track the grazing leases and renewals, and comment. And use the BLM data that peers compiled to show that it's livestock, not horses, that are doing the majority of damage to the landscapes. This is my dog Walnut, who is in all of my presentations. So in addition to these sources here, Todd Schumann has extracted BLM data specifically for wild horses. So there's 67 allotments that cite horses in their assessment, and he's got all those put into a Word document. And I can send those along to you. And then I'm happy to go through our map in real time with anybody, and we can look at the map together, and I can show you how to look at the allotment by allotment data. So thank you all again for your interest and for your advocacy work. And I'm
Chandra,
gonna,
thank you so much.
great, I'm gonna stop sharing, look at all of these chats. So how do
Yes.
we want to do that? Yeah,
I have been taking in questions, so I'll handle that for you, and I will
great.
just ask you. And I would imagine some new questions will pop up. So some of these questions I think are just need some clarification. So Kim wants to know, and I think this is a great question, can you buy a grazing lease and then not use it, aka put no cows on it?
This has been litigated and you cannot. But if the agency, so I know, for instance, the Nature Conservancy has bought or has grazing leases where they've had the stocking numbers reduced significantly. And in some cases, they've reduced, BLM has chosen to reduce them while they work on restoration projects. So it does happen, but legally, no, you cannot.
I've got a follow-up question to that, and that is, how will the public lands rule impact grazing allotments? I know that there will be some land that will be available for conservation leasing, which I'm also in addendum kind of curious what your thoughts are, but maybe for a later time on, that seems to be the Department of the Interior dropping the ball and then asking other people to pick up the ball to take care of land. That's a personal opinion, but so yeah, I'm just curious, how do you think that this new rule will affect grazing leases?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that they chose to expand a program by looking at land health standards across all lands, a program that is obviously they're not able to handle with the staff and the appropriations that they have now, right? We saw the huge percentage of lands that are unassessed. So by adding just more to BLM's portfolio, I don't know how they're going to be able to do that. Also, I think there's going to be challenges with this administration. I don't know if this rule is going to stand. As far as how it will impact grazing allotments, I don't know if it will. The conservation leases, will they be on current allotments, or are they going to open up additional lands for that? And are they going to be restoration? Like, I don't expect that it's going to negatively impact any rancher's ability to run the same number of cows on their allotments.
Understood. Okay, we've got a great question from Mary. She wonders if Peer plans to collect similar data on Forest Service land.
I think that's interesting. And I think we probably should do it, right? Like it makes sense. It's a much smaller amount of acreage, but and I don't know exactly how Service keeps their data, but I mean, I think we should do it.
I think that would be interesting. The Wild Narrative Project, our little newsroom, has been working to cover the Devil's Garden wild horse issue up in the Modoc National Forest in California, and we are finding it dang near impossible to find information. And it almost seems that since the data isn't readily available and no one that we know of is currently analyzing or holding them accountable, their lack of transparency is even more egregious. And so, yeah, that's a little plug. That would be great.
And thinking about it, what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense because when we first started collecting the data, we had to actually sue the agency to get the data. And then it came in like, photocopies, and it was a mess. And now at this point, BLM has gotten, they're trying to get all of the data done electronically. They've developed a standardized system. This was under the Biden administration to develop a standardized system for keeping the land health standard records at each field office. And they're able to give us like these nice spreadsheets now. So, I mean, it took 10 years, but, I think that would be a really productive way to address grazing on Forest Service lands. And, by us getting this data like this, the agency can get the data like this too. Like, I think it does make state directors a little bit more aware of the overall impact of the livestock grazing program.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, Lori's got a question that we could, I think, all use clarification on. On the range where horses are determined to be degrading the land, how is that determined? She follows up, is it ranges that have never had is it ranges that have never had livestock on it? Yeah, just looking for a little bit more information there.
So we're looking at like the allotments, the livestock grazing allotments. So if there's a herd management area that doesn't have cattle on it, it doesn't have a grazing lease on it, then that data wouldn't be included in what we've compiled here. And so I don't know if they're using the land health standards on that land, the outside of the allotment. They're certainly using it on when there's an overlap of a grazing lease with a herd management area, which there is often. But with the new land health rule, like it seems like that's the way they're going to be looking at those lands going forward.
Understood. Karen asks, doesn't BLM use the term livestock to include horses in their reports? How do we explain that to legislators?
I don't know what kind of reports. So she means maybe domestic horses, like if someone, because people can have domestic horses as a form of livestock, right, with forage allocations.
Right. Let's see. Karen, if you are still on the call, can you add a little clarifier to your question, please, and just repop it in the chat? And then let's see. I've got a couple more questions. I read a while back your report about the backlog in FOIAs and how across agencies this has become an increasing problem. We know that these agencies are understaffed and that continues to be a problem. My question is, say, for example, my team is going to submit a FOIA, but we have a hunch that someone else has already FOIA'd for the same information. What are best practices on reaching out to fellow advocates or peer or a newsroom like Wild Narrative or a group like Chasing Horses to see if they have already started the work on or completed the work on getting that information?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea because there is a FOIA policy that if the same document has been requested 3 times, that they have to publish it. And I think the agencies don't always know which, they're not tracking that. And I don't know that there's this push for transparency within the agencies, but I think we really need to be getting together and talking about that. Like, what are you guys looking for? We're looking for the same thing. Let's just tell the agency to make it public. I mean, I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that this administration is going to be a lot less willing to work with us on that, but trying to reduce that backlog. And we did see some progress at the end of the last administration where where there were some huge backlogs in sub-agencies that they detailed over some other employees to try and and they were calling us, hey, can we combine these FOIAs? Do you still want this one that's 3 years old? So I think that there was an attempt, at least in the last year, I think, by the Biden administration to kind of push through a lot of the FOIAs.
Understood. Okay, let's see. Karen has provided us with a clarification. She says, I've heard that the wild horses were referred to as livestock, and doesn't the BLM consider them livestock in their assessments?
I don't think so, because I don't think so. I think that when you're looking at a land health assessment, they will write horses on the line of what's causing the damage. But if that's what a BLM employee told you, that I would think that that's a problem with the something at BLM, which is that each field office has their own culture, and really trying to get things standardized across the agency is important. So if there's some field office that decided that wild horses should be classified as livestock in a land health standard evaluation, that's something that really is going to make all of the data inconsistent and just difficult for anyone to evaluate.
Understood. Okay, so speaking of land health evaluation, we've got a question. What is the standard of a healthy landscape, and how does the classification work if it's not healthy? What are some indicators there?
So they have experts at BLM who are responsible for assessing land health, and they use the standards and guidelines. And those standards and guidelines vary by state because each state has different ecosystems, rainfall. So the expectations are different in Nevada compared to Montana. So they'll often put an exclosure over an area, so a little fence bubble that the cows can't eat the forage that's within this little fenced area, and so they can compare what it would look like without cattle grazing there to what it looks like. And then they'll do transects also, where they'll count within a certain area the number of native species that they see and the height of a lot of the land. And so BLM is starting to do a lot more of this AIM assessment. Maybe you've heard of that. So that's assessment, inventory, and management, and they have an entire section on their website about it. And so this AIM section, they will do trainings for the public. So if you're super interested in finding out how exactly do they assess lands, what do the ecologists look at, you can do a training with them. So there's been a couple of people I know at WWP who have actually gone and done the training with BLM. So
Awesome.
And I'm sure they would welcome you.
Awesome. That's very helpful. Thank you. Let's see. I've got a question. This has to do with drought. So you mentioned that when they're giving reasoning, when BLM is giving their justifications for removing wild horses, they will often, if not always, talk about drought and climate change. But that they don't have the same response when it comes to removing or reducing livestock. Is there a resource that Peer has, or that you know of that someone else has, that can help advocates connect the dots when responding to that argument, or to help, other than, or not, maybe not other than, but just a document that points out that there's no national response to livestock in the same way that there are wild horses? Do you understand?
I
You know
think
what I mean?
though, just showing the kind of the general data of the large amount of land that is failing land health conditions because of cattle compared to horses is really the most effective. And there can be responses to drought. Everything at BLM is so siloed out by field office, right? So one field office might do it and then another one might not. So knowing what's going on in your area, where you're looking and who is working on these programs, the range programs in the same area where you're advocating for a certain herd management area, I think is really important too.
Okay, that's great. And then a follow-up question to that is, I've lost my train of thought because a new question just popped up here in the chat. I'll come back to it. Wendy wants to know, how can these assessments be trusted? So I'm assuming she's asking about when the BLM expert is on the ground assessing landscape health.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. And if you look at the map, I've looked at our grazing map, and you'll see in the same ecosystem, like 4 allotments in a row that are classified as failing. And then there's this one that's classified as meeting all standards. And it really looks sort of suspicious. Or for instance, if you look at New Mexico, which is an outlier on the states also, which it seems like they've got a lot of lands classified as meeting all standards when in fact, right at the border, then you move into a different state management. So I think there are questions within the data that those are legitimate questions to ask. And I think it's really the culture of the field offices and then the state offices and what they're trying to do. And I think going forward, like we saw the data change from 2019 to 2023, we saw a lot more lands classified as meeting range health conditions. And I don't know if this is a result of knowing that people are looking at the data, or if there really are making management changes. But, there's a lot of really good employees out there, and a lot of them take a lot of pride in their work and really are looking at the land. Like an ecologist is actually out there looking at the forage. And so I think, our inclination is to trust the BLM rather than to not, because the data is, if they were all, if none of the lands were failing land health conditions, then certainly we would be suspicious. But, they've been pretty honest in a lot of the cases.
To that end, there's a question. Do you have a good relationship with BLM?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we've presented this data with Tracy Stone Manning, so the director of BLM, the deputy assistant director. They were willing to meet with us. I had multiple follow-up meetings with the people who are working on standardizing the land health standards data. So yeah, I think so. I think it's sometimes hard to get certain state directors to respond, or field offices to respond. But generally, I think, at least in this last administration, we've had some really positive collaborative work with BLM.
That's great to hear. Okay, I figured out what my question was, and I hope that this question and conversation will be helpful for advocates. So an argument that, let's see, a point that is made in environmental assessments often tends to be the how local economies depend on the ranching that happens in their area. And then there's another statistic that says that public lands ranching only accounts for 2% of beef production and sale and feeding America. Those can't be completely disentangled. They're not exactly the same, but I guess my question is there a response, or does PEER have data on how truly those rural communities do depend on public lands ranching? And I guess my addendum to that is, and I was talking about this in a prior presentation, how as we look into Devil's Garden, again, it's Forest Service, but one of the main ranches in the area is owned by a multimillionaire who lives 4 hours away and is a real estate mogul and just wants to play cowboy. And so I was just curious if you have any data or response to that.
I don't have any data on that, and I would love to see that, like the percentage of allotments that are leased by multimillionaires, right? And we've all heard about Ted Turner and his huge number of leases. So but I do know that we have talked to a lot of BLM employees, and in the rural areas, they live in those communities, and and it can be really hard to make management changes to a small allotment, that where they know the actual person and their kids go to school together. And so that pressure is real on those employees. And, there are things that BLM could do, though, which is to move some of those decisions away from the field and move them to the state offices. So then those employees couldn't be spotlighted.
Do you have a recommendation for advocates in helping to advocate for that, to, actually help take the pressure off of those local BLMs and their BLM employees and their communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've talked about trying, there's the contrast, which they call it, swivel chair management, land management, right? If it's all being done by Washington or the state office and not being looked at locally, there's a fine balance there, right? So you want to have actual data from people on the ground, not just aerial imaging or satellite imaging that's being used more and more. But you also need to balance the fact that those individuals may be in a culture where it's not acceptable to reduce livestock management. So yeah, it's tricky.
Thank you. I know that is tricky. Let's see, Mary asks, she says, I might have missed this, but does your data include the name of like the individual or company who has the grazing permits on each allotment?
No, we don't. We have the name of the allotment. That's all. So.
Okay. And another question, are water assessments seeing a difference in how cattle versus horses drink and utilize the area, leave and don't pollute with excrement, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I think that's a good question, but I just don't know the difference in horses and cattle and how they use stock tanks and troughs and pipelines.
Great. Okay, I think I have covered most of the questions. Chris, Heather, do you see
I
anything
kind of
big
wanted
that
to
I've
cover
missed?
Cecile's. She's asked it a couple times, and Cecile's
Oh,
from Europe, Chandra, but and she sees a lot of horse herds over there. But
Hmm.
in reference to her question, which is what does BLM do to or with land that's been damaged by cattle? Are you guys seeing any instances where livestock are actually removed from the land because the land is not meeting health standards? I know that's a tough question. But it's we've got that CFR, right? 4710.5, I think it is, where they're meant to remove livestock so have you guys ever actually seen a case where that's happened? Is it documented anywhere on BLM's website that you guys have seen?
I'm, I'm trying to think. I mean, I've commented on a lot of permits, and I've never seen them reduce the number of AUM based on the preliminary permit and then the final permit. What they'll sometimes say is, we authorize, this many AUMs, but they're actually only running this many. So let's say they authorize 150, but they're only actually running 100. That's but they won't cut out that wiggle room, and that's how they'll respond when you say, hey, this land is not meeting land health standards. I think it's, I don't look at enough allotments, I don't think, across BLM to be able to say, because I'm more looking at the data that, we get rather than tracking allotment by allotment. The times that I have commented on a permit have been when an employee has come to us and brought it to our attention. So.
Cecile's following that up with, and I just want to answer it for her quickly. She just says, I wonder if BLM only sees horses or only sees cattle, or if there's any way to see them together when doing rangeland assessments.
Yeah, they do. They, in some cases, we've seen that they call horses and cattle as responsible for lives or for the landscape health conditions. So I think I showed you the slide with the bars. So there was like the second one was like 6.5 million acres are failing land health conditions because of horses combined with livestock.
Yeah, and I mean, she's following up with another question. The data of cattle damage is so high. Why are there no consequences? And I think Cecile, and I don't know if you were on one of our earlier presentations, get the book This Land by Christopher Ketchum, because that will explain to you and to all of you what is happening and why it's happening and how long it's been happening to our public lands that ranchers and livestock have been out there. And it will be very much an eye opener for you. I remember when I picked up the book, I was actually reading parts of it out loud to my husband, and even he was gawping at it, you know. So that's a really good book for all of you to help understand. And like Kim says, it's money driven, but only in the sense that and as you know, Chandra, the new grazing fee for 2025 just came out. And of course they left it at its lowest possible allowed amount, right? Of just $1.35 per month for a cow calf pair or 5 sheep or goats. Though we rarely see herds of goats out on our public lands, but we certainly see thousands of sheep in a herd at a time. And by keeping that rate so low, mainly the corporate ranchers are the ones who are profiting off of the fact that they get to pay that low fee to graze those animals on our public land. Whereas many private ranchers still, even with that low fee, are not making a profit. And one of the huge issues is that for those people who have permits and are not using them, they will then sublet them out. And is that legal, Chandra? Is that legal for them to be subletting out a grazing allotment permit for a much
Yeah,
higher
they
rate?
have to get authorization from BLM, but they do. BLM will give them authorization to do it. And that is a good book. It's a lot of cultural issues, like these rural areas and the tradition and the public or unwillingness, the legislature's unwillingness to touch this program. I mean, there's a lot of conservation groups that don't even want to comment on livestock grazing. When you look at BLM's website, it's like hidden away, right? Like it's just something that they don't talk about. They talk about recreation and they talk about the wild horse program, but they don't talk about their livestock program.
And I think something that we forget too as advocates is that, while livestock is certainly the main cause of degradation on our public lands, recreational use in many cases is also just absolutely devastating. The trails that the OHVs and off-road vehicles and dirt bikes like to create, the fact that when those units are present, they not only scare wild horses, and I've seen it multiple times, you guys, they will hear a dirt bike from a mile away and they will just take off and stop running. But it also pushes out the native wildlife. Um, you know, while we want to allow, we'd like to see multiple use on our public lands, there are many other factors that are contributing to the degradation of it besides just livestock use. All right, Jen, I'm going to let you take back over. Thank you for letting me pitch in there.
Oh, of course. Thanks, Heather. Thanks for catching Cecile's question. I appreciate that. Let's see, I do have another question. Someone's curious, is your organization going to be affected by the incoming administration? For example, there's a lot of turnover right now. We've been hearing reports of early retirement being suggested. Yeah, how do you anticipate that affecting Pierre?
Yeah, we've had so many calls. It's been really overwhelming and sad how many employees have been affected and are fearful for their jobs. And we've been trying to offer some resources for people. We have filed a lawsuit to prevent the expansion of the Schedule F program, which would allow more federal employees to be classified as political, and that way they could be fired at will. The probationary employees, so people who've been hired within the last year in EPA, were all told, that you could be fired at any moment. They're just really trying to create this sense of fear and frustration within employees by giving them sort of half information so that they will quit, because that's the ultimate goal of the administration, is to have just less federal employees at all. So yeah, we've had just this huge influx of people. And there's the return to the office policy, which is also, we've had a lot of calls about that. But yeah, I mean, we're trying to advise people about their rights, and then when people are actually left off, there's the administrative leave policy. They're putting people on administrative leave without an end date, which we're arguing is illegal to do also. So I think we're just going to be seeing more and more changes. BLM doesn't have a director yet, but when the director comes in, I expect that they'll take some actions to let go of a lot of employees.
Understood.
Can I ask, as we're watching those things unfold outside of like wild horse advocacy, are those areas where it's also worth it for us to contact our congressman and say, hey, what the heck is going on? I don't approve of this. What are you doing to stop this or change this?
You're saying, like, should you contact your congressperson about the wild horse areas, or?
No, about this all this other stuff that's happening within our government, like you were just talking about with all the employees and Elon Musk taking out over the treasury and different stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think we do need to have an uprising because Congress is going to have to act. So I think that the more calls they're getting and the more directed the calls are, because they have to prioritize what they're going to respond to, because there's so much going on right now. But this worker fear is just, it's awful. So absolutely call in. Yeah, we do. We need better employees, and we need more employees at these agencies, not less, especially at BLM. I mean, when you just look at, we've done some comparison between the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, National Park Service, to compare number of employees per acre. So Park Service by far has the most employees per acre, and BLM is got like 1/10 of the number. It's just striking, because some of these allotments, like in Nevada, are just millions of acres, and they don't have the personnel to go out there and actually see what's going on the land.
Wow, that's striking. I have one more question. Ginger says, I worry that the new administration will allow for the sale of our public lands to private entities, which will degrade the land even more. This has been proposed. Is it a real possibility?
Yeah, I think that that they would probably like to give away lands to the state. And as you know, Utah has been had it the Supreme Court elected not to take this lawsuit, but Utah had tried to get a lot of BLMs transferred over to the states, and 12 other states joined with Utah. So there are states that want these lands for themselves. And at that point, I think they would find that they couldn't manage them, and they would sell them off to private entities. So I think it's a real concern, and Utah is spending a lot of money working on this issue. And so I would just be watching that and really reminding your legislator that these are not, even though they're located within a state, these are federal lands. They belong to all of us.
Okay, let's see. I do have another question. I just keep rolling in. How you doing?
Good.
You good? Okay, great.
Yeah.
I know you're on it. Okay, so Heather is reacting to this question, but and I don't think there's a clear answer, but I'm gonna share it anyway. Vi says, so often BLM has lied to us. Any accountability for that? We seem to be just rejected and feel powerless. And so many are doing so much, but what more can we do to correct this?
Yeah, I mean, I hear about this also from people at BLM who work within the wild horse program. know that it's a really difficult program for them to work within. And a lot of them are very scared for the work that they do because it's so high profile. And so they feel attacked by both sides, right? They feel that the advocates aren't able to support them, and then the agency also isn't able to support them. So it's really a difficult program. And I think just trying to get the focus away from that program and onto the grazing program is really the solution, the best solution right now, is to really talk to your legislators about that.
That's really great information. Thank you. So many people are just commending you on your presentation and for the information that you're sharing. I'm sure that you can see it in the chat, but just want to reiterate here, thank you so much. Janine has a question. Is there a place you suggest to submit photos and video documentation of HMAs and horses versus cattle?
You know, it's really useful to have like photos. So yeah, you can send them to me, and I'm happy to kind of keep them. And I can share them with our grazing coalition also. That might be something that we could start doing, but thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
I think we've covered everything. Chris, did you want to pipe in about anything else?
No, I think this was amazing. So, and everyone really did enjoy it and learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Chandra. This is eye-opening as always, and I think this is a really important, as you just said, I think this is a really important area to focus on for wild horse advocates, and we can't thank you enough for sharing all of your information. And thank you to your team, because I know that you've got a team that are working on these issues and really doing the hard work of talking to whistleblowers and people who are afraid for their jobs and people who are, for all different reasons. So thank you to everyone up here for doing the work.
Thank you. And thank all of you guys for all of your work advocating. It's really great.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandra, for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.